Hi, I wanted to talk about AWS CodePipeline. This is an Amazon service that allows you to take some source code, define how to build it, and then define how to deploy it. I like this service quite a bit because it allows me to take web apps I've worked on and provide a persistent place for that web app to run. In this video, I plan to talk about my experience with configuring one of these projects, and I'll go over some of the gotchas I ran into and some troubleshooting methods that were helpful. My web app is written in Golang. It's a simple web server that'll just return hello world. The Golang binary is built into a Docker container at code build time, and that Docker container is deployed to an EC2 instance at code deploy time. The first piece of code pipeline is the source code configuration. If we look at this first box here in my pipeline, this is where I'm defining where the source code comes from. I've hooked my GitHub account up to this as the source provider, and when you say connect to GitHub here, it will present you with a list of all repositories in your GitHub account. And then I just took the default output artifact here. The next part of the pipeline is the code build step. AWS Code Build is a service that allows you to define how to take the source code and generate build artifacts. For my code build project, I named it React VR Build. I told it to use the React VR GitHub repository. And then you have to define an environment with which to build your web app. I am using an Amazon-provided Docker container because I want to be able to build and push new Docker containers to a registry. The build specification is a YAML file that defines what to do within this build host. And I'll go into that more in a minute. I'm going to generate some S3 output artifacts, and I have already created an IAM role that will be used to execute the commands from the build host. Now I'm going to dive into that buildspec.yaml script. At the top here, you need to specify version 0.1 for now. You're able to specify environment variables, and there's a section here called phases with some subsections. In the install subsection here, I'm apt-get updating so that I can install some software packages, in particular Golang. In the pre-build phase, I'm logging into AWS ECR, and then in the build phase here, the build host will navigate into the server directory and run go build, which is how you generate Go binaries from Go source code. After the source code builds, then I'm running a docker build command that will tag this new image with the ECR tag that I want it to have, and in the post-build phase, I am pushing that new Docker container. It's important to note that if you wish to use AWS ECR to maintain your Docker images, that you first go into the ECS console and navigate to repositories and create your Docker repository beforehand. One major difference between AWS ECR and your typical Docker registry is that you can't simply push a new Docker tag to the registry and have that create that container for you. You have to first create it. And you can do this either in the user interface here or with the AWS CLI for ECS. Once you create a new Docker repository, you need to come into the settings and edit the permissions. I've already done this, but when I created this permission statement, I gave it a name of code build push to ECR, effect allow, and I selected push and pull actions, and then I saved that statement. As I was developing my buildspec.yaml, I encountered various problems that needed to be debugged. I found that the best way to debug that file was to come into the code build console and navigate to History, select an individual build run of the most recent attempt, and I'll actually go here to a failed attempt to highlight how I debugged this. And inside of here, at the bottom of the build run, there's a View Entire Logs link, and that will bring you into CloudWatch here, which provides you with the output of the build spec commands running. So this particular execution error was from not being able to run go build. So being able to see what is failing and how it's failing makes building your project much easier. The last step of the code pipeline process is the code deploy step. And before I dive into that configuration, I want to look at my EC2 setup for a moment. Inside of EC2, I have an instance that I've called code deploy instance, and I tagged this EC2 container. I gave it a key of env and a value of production, and this will become important when we look at the code deploy configuration. In addition to tagging this instance, I SSH'd into this instance and installed the code deploy agent and Docker, which you see running here. Now that I've created an EC2 instance that is tagged correctly and has the right software installed, I can use it to be the target of code deploys. Inside of the code deploy console here, I'll pull up my project's configuration. The first settings are defining which EC2 instances to deploy to. And this is where the tagging of the EC2 instance comes in. So here's my same env equals production that we mentioned before. And code deploy will quickly identify the number of instances that match on that tag. And so here it is, identifying the EC2 instance we just looked at. And then you can specify a deployment procedure. I've chosen mine to be one at a time. So if I had a pool of instances here, then one at a time they would be deployed to. You can specify triggers and alarms and rollback preferences. I just attached an admin role to this code deploy project. In reality, the IAM permissions that this service needs are going to be things like being able to communicate with EC2, and in my case, since I am pulling a Docker image from ECR, it needs to be able to communicate with ECS. One additional aspect of using code deploy is that you need to define a file in your repository called appspec.yaml, and this file will tell code deploy what to do when this container is deployed to an EC2 instance. So here's my appspec.yaml, and there's a section here on hooks, and there are many hooks. I've only experimented with application start, but all that I'm doing with application start is running a shell script called deploy.shell, which is defined inside of a directory called server. So I'm going to vsplit here, server, deploy shell, and this is quite literally a shell command to run whenever this project gets deployed. So I'm going to start by logging into ECR and removing a currently running container called app server and pulling an ECR container called react_vr server, which is what we tagged in our build step, and then running that container, calling it app server, linking the host's port 80 to the container's port 80, and running it in daemon mode. You can debug the code deploy by logging into the EC2 instance that you're attempting to deploy to and tailing a file called varlog AWS code deploy agent agent.log. And this is the file that gets written to as your appspec.yaml is running. This immediately found a number of issues I had. In particular, one issue that I ran into was I did not drop in the ECR credentials into my EC2 user's home directory. It allows you to run the ECS login. So that concludes how to configure a pretty basic code pipeline project. As you make changes, you can watch those changes flow through the pipeline. So I just bumped the source code, and now it just successfully downloaded that source and is making that change throughout the pipeline. This project, like I said, is pretty basic. There are a number of ways that would probably be good to extend it. Number one, security-wise, using admin roles is never good for true production, and it would be interesting to experiment with using ECS to manage the Docker containers running on the EC2 instance, rather than using my own commands in the deploy shell script. But for the most part, this provides a great way to deploy your projects to a persistent, dedicated EC2 instance. So thanks for watching.